Grand Hotel, Berlin, November 8, 1931. 2100 hours and Hans Thilo Schmidt sits in room 412, waiting for a man he knows only as Monsieur Lemoine, his hands trembling slightly as he arranges classified documents on the hotel desk. Documents that represent Germany's most closely guarded military secret. The operating instructions and daily key settings for the Enigma cipher machine that protects every sensitive communication flowing through the German military. The 43-year-old German cipher clerk, employed in the Chiffrierstelle, the cipher office of the Reichswehr Ministry in Berlin, has brought with him materials that could unlock Hitler's most protected communications, blueprints that will eventually help the Allies read German military traffic throughout World War II, intelligence that will save countless lives and shorten the war by years. What Hans Thilo Schmidt cannot possibly know as he prepares to betray his country for money that will fund his expensive lifestyle and support his multiple affairs, what no one meeting in this Berlin hotel room could imagine, is that the information changing hands tonight will become the foundation for one of the greatest intelligence triumphs in history, that Polish mathematicians will use these materials to break codes the Germans believe unbreakable, and that the spy himself, codenamed Daché by French intelligence, will vanish into mystery, his fate remaining uncertain for decades, his contribution to Allied victory hidden for 50 years, while historians credit others with achievements that began with his treachery. French intelligence has every reason to celebrate this recruitment, believing they have secured access to German military secrets at a time when Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party are rising to power, when Germany is secretly rearming in violation of Versailles Treaty restrictions, when understanding German intentions could mean the difference between peace and another devastating war. But what the French intelligence officers cultivating this German traitor do not fully comprehend is that they have stumbled upon something far more valuable than routine military intelligence, that the Enigma machine represents a cryptographic revolution that will shape modern warfare, and that the thin, nervous German sitting in this hotel room holds keys that will unlock a technological puzzle considered mathematically unsolvable by the world's leading cryptographers. Hans Thilo Schmidt's journey to betrayal began not in ideology or patriotism, but in the most banal of human motivations: financial desperation, social ambition, and deep-seated resentment at life's unfairness. Born on May 13, 1888, in Berlin, the second son of distinguished university professor Rudolf Schmidt and Johanna Schmidt, daughter of a baroness, Hans Thilo grew up in educated society, where family connections and social position mattered enormously. His older brother Rudolf followed their father's expectations perfectly, attending military academies, earning commissions, building a career that would eventually lead to becoming a Wehrmacht general, commanding panzer divisions. Hans Thilo, the second son without his brother's discipline or drive, followed a more erratic path, serving as an officer in World War I but never distinguishing himself, finding the military life constraining rather than fulfilling, dreaming of wealth and luxury that his modest officer's pay could never provide. The end of World War I in 1918 proved catastrophic for Hans Thilo's ambitions, as the Treaty of Versailles reduced the German military to 100,000 men, forcing massive demobilization that left hundreds of thousands of former officers seeking civilian employment in a devastated economy where jobs were scarce and inflation was destroying savings. Hans Thilo left the military in 1920, attempted various business ventures that failed spectacularly, watched his modest savings evaporate during the hyperinflation of 1923 when wheelbarrows of currency could barely buy bread, and found himself in his mid-30s with no prospects, no money, mounting debts, and a lifestyle he could not afford. He had married Charlotte Toelkowski, daughter of a wealthy family, in 1913, and they had 2 children, but his inability to provide the comfortable life Charlotte expected created constant tension in their marriage. Hans Thilo developed expensive tastes, including numerous affairs that required money for gifts, hotel rooms, and maintaining appearances that he desperately lacked. The opportunity that would define the rest of his life came in 1926, when Hans Thilo's successful brother Rudolf, by then a rising officer in the Reichswehr, used his connections to secure Hans Thilo a civilian position in the Reichswehr Ministry's cipher office. The job paid adequately, but not generously, involved routine clerical work managing cipher materials, maintaining files, and handling the distribution of codebooks and cipher keys to military units. For someone with Hans Thilo's expensive habits and social ambitions, the salary was hopelessly inadequate, leaving him perpetually in debt, unable to maintain the lifestyle he desired, watching his brother rise to prominence while he remained an anonymous bureaucrat handling secret materials he could not personally exploit. The cruel irony that he worked daily with information worth enormous sums to foreign intelligence services while earning a clerk's wages did not escape Hans Thielow's attention. By 1931, Hans Thilo Schmidt's financial situation had become desperate, as debts accumulated. His affairs required money he did not have, his wife demanded explanations for expenses he could not justify, and his position in society seemed fixed at a level far below what he believed he deserved. The psychological pressure of working with his brother's success as constant comparison, of handling Germany's most sensitive materials while earning a pittance, of maintaining appearances while drowning in debt, pushed Hans Thilo toward a decision that would make him simultaneously one of the most valuable spies in history and one of the most despised traitors in German memory. He began considering whether the classified materials passing through his office might be converted into cash that would solve his financial problems, whether foreign intelligence services would pay for Reichswehr secrets, whether he possessed the courage or desperation to commit treason. The recruitment occurred through a business connection that seemed coincidental but was carefully orchestrated by French intelligence, which had identified Hans Thilo as potentially vulnerable through his financial troubles and his access to classified materials. A German businessman named Lemoine, whose real name was Rodolphe Lemoine, and who worked as a French intelligence agent, approached Hans Thilo in 1931 with a business proposition that gradually evolved into discussion of more sensitive matters. Lemoine, an experienced intelligence officer skilled at recruiting agents, recognized Hans Thilo's vulnerabilities immediately. Understanding that this resentful, ambitious man with access to valuable secrets and crushing debts could be turned through a combination of money and flattery, the initial meetings focused on legitimate business discussions, establishing rapport, building trust, until Lemoine felt confident enough to broach the possibility of Hans Thilo providing information about his work in exchange for substantial payment. Hans Thilo's decision to betray Germany did not involve dramatic moral wrestling or agonized conscience, but rather cold calculation about risk versus reward, about whether he could provide information without being caught, about how much French intelligence would pay for different types of secrets. He possessed no ideological objections to Hitler, no moral qualms about Nazi policies, no passionate belief in French democracy or Allied causes. His motivation was purely mercenary, driven by desire for money that would pay his debts, finance his affairs, and fund the luxurious lifestyle he craved but could not afford on his government salary. When Lemoine offered 10,000 Reichsmarks for materials related to the Enigma cipher machine, Hans Thilo accepted without hesitation, seeing this as a business transaction rather than treason, rationalizing that he was merely selling information to people who would probably acquire it anyway through other means. The Enigma machine that Hans Thilo agreed to betray represented the cutting edge of cryptographic technology in 1931, an electromechanical cipher machine that used rotating wheels called rotors to encipher messages through substitution ciphers that changed with every letter typed. The commercial version of Enigma had been available since the early 1920s, purchased by banks and businesses seeking secure communications, but the German military had modified the machine extensively, adding additional rotors, introducing a plug board that created billions of possible settings, implementing daily key sheets that changed the machine configuration every 24 hours. German cryptographers believed they had created an unbreakable cipher because the number of possible settings exceeded 150 trillion, making exhaustive search mathematically impossible with 1930s technology. The daily key sheets that Hans Thilo would provide listed the specific rotor positions, plugboard settings, and ring settings that German military units used each day, transforming an impossible mathematical problem into a much simpler technical challenge. The first meeting at the Grand Hotel in November 1931 established the pattern that would continue for 7 years, as Hans Thilo provided French intelligence with progressively more valuable materials about Enigma and German military preparations. He photographed operating instructions, key sheets, technical manuals, anything related to Enigma that passed through his office, meeting regularly with Lemoine or other French handlers in hotels in Berlin, Amsterdam, Prague, and other cities where they could meet without attracting attention. The French intelligence service, initially uncertain what to do with highly technical cryptographic materials they did not fully understand, shared the information with British intelligence and Polish intelligence hoping one of their allies possessed the mathematical expertise to exploit what Hans Thilo was providing. The British, confident in their own cryptographic capabilities and skeptical that machine ciphers could be broken, largely ignored the materials, a decision they would later regret. The Polish intelligence service, understanding that they faced existential threat from German rearmament and that breaking German codes could provide early warning of invasion plans, assigned their best cryptographers to analyze Hans Thilo's materials. 3 young Polish mathematicians, Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Rosicki, and Henryk Zygalski, working at the Polish Cipher Bureau in Warsaw, began studying the Enigma documents that Hans Thilo had provided in late 1932, combining theoretical mathematics with the practical information about machine settings and operating procedures that only an insider could supply. Rejewski, a brilliant mathematician who approached cryptography as pure mathematical problem rather than linguistic puzzle, used the key sheets to reverse engineer the internal wiring of the military Enigma's rotors, a feat that German cryptographers had assumed was impossible even with access to enciphered messages. By December 1932, just over a year after Hans Thilo's first betrayal, the Polish mathematicians had successfully broken the German military Enigma, reading German messages with reasonable reliability, providing Polish intelligence with unprecedented insight into German military thinking and planning. This achievement, made possible by Hans Thilo's treachery, represented one of the greatest cryptographic breakthroughs in history, though it would remain secret for decades. Hans Thilo continued selling secrets to French intelligence throughout the 1930s, meeting his handlers regularly, providing updated key sheets as the Germans modified their procedures, delivering information about German rearmament that violated Versailles Treaty restrictions, reporting on military deployments and planning discussions he overheard in the cipher office. The French paid him well, providing the money that funded his expensive lifestyle, his multiple affairs, including a particularly costly relationship with a much younger woman, his taste for luxury goods and fine hotels that his government salary would never support. He lived a double life, maintaining his position as trusted clerk in the Reichswehr cipher office by day while betraying his country's secrets by night, rationalizing his actions as merely business transactions, apparently feeling no guilt about treachery that could cost German lives and national security. The transformation of Nazi Germany from defeated nation to military powerhouse proceeded throughout the 1930s, while Hans Thilo documented it for French intelligence, providing information about Wehrmacht rearmament, Luftwaffe expansion, and military planning that should have alerted European leaders to the coming war. Hans Thilo's reports describe German production of tanks, aircraft and artillery in violation of treaty restrictions, detailed Wehrmacht organizational structures and command relationships, revealed military planning for potential operations against Poland, Czechoslovakia, and France. This information, combined with the continuing ability to read Enigma encrypted messages thanks to his initial betrayal, gave the Allies unprecedented insight into German intentions and capabilities. But European leaders, desperate to avoid another war and unwilling to believe that Germany would risk confrontation, largely ignored intelligence warnings, choosing to appease Hitler rather than oppose him, wasting the advantage that Hans Thilo's treachery had provided. The value of Hans Thilo's information increased dramatically after Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, as Polish cryptographers fleeing to France before Warsaw fell brought their Enigma-breaking techniques with them, sharing their knowledge with French and British intelligence. The British, who had previously dismissed the possibility of breaking Enigma, suddenly gained access to both the Polish mathematical methods and the continuing stream of information from Hans Thilo about German cipher procedures. The code-breaking operation that became known as Ultra, centered at Bletchley Park in England, built directly upon the foundation that Polish mathematicians had established using materials Hans Thilo provided. Throughout the war, ultra-intelligence derived from reading German Enigma messages would provide Allied commanders with strategic and tactical information that influenced campaigns in North Africa, the Battle of the Atlantic, the invasion of Italy, and the Normandy landings. Information that military historians estimate shortened the war by 2 to 4 years and saved millions of lives. Hans Thilo's spying career ended abruptly in 1940 after the German invasion of France exposed French intelligence files that compromised numerous agents and operations. Though remarkably, his identity remained protected because the French had used multiple cover names and had been careful to compartmentalize information about their most valuable sources. He continued working in the Reichswehr cipher office, by then transformed into the Wehrmacht cipher section, apparently unaware that his espionage activities might be discovered, living on the money he had accumulated through years of selling secrets. His older brother Rudolf had become General Schmidt, commanding panzer divisions in the invasions of Poland and France, adding cruel irony to Hans Thilo's betrayal, as the secrets he sold were being used against German forces that his brother commanded. Whether Rudolf knew of his younger brother's treachery remains uncertain, but the family connection would ultimately prove fatal to Hans Thilo. The collapse of Hans Thilo's double life came through a combination of German counterintelligence work and betrayals by captured agents under interrogation, though the exact sequence of events remains disputed by historians. In 1942 or early 1943, the Gestapo became aware that the Allies were reading some German communications, though they did not initially suspect that Enigma had been compromised, because breaking Enigma was considered mathematically impossible. German counterintelligence began investigating possible sources of leaks, interrogating personnel with access to sensitive information, pursuing leads that eventually pointed toward the cipher office where Hans Thilo worked. The investigation might have focused on him because of his financial situation that improved mysteriously during the 1930s, or because interrogation of captured French intelligence officers produced information that matched his access and position, or simply because systematic security reviews identified him as someone whose lifestyle exceeded his income. On March 28, 1943, Gestapo officers arrested Hans Thilo Schmidt at his office in the Reichswehr Ministry, taking him to Gestapo headquarters for interrogation that would continue for months, using techniques that ranged from psychological pressure to physical torture to extract confession about the full extent of his espionage. Hans Thilo, facing men who showed no mercy to traitors, who considered betrayal of the Reich a crime deserving the most severe punishment, apparently broke relatively quickly, admitting his contacts with French intelligence, describing the materials he had provided, naming Lemoyne and other handlers he had worked with over the years. The Gestapo interrogators, realizing they had uncovered one of the most damaging espionage cases in German history, someone who had betrayed the Enigma system itself, prepared a prosecution that would result in public trial and execution as warning to others who might consider treason. What happened next remains shrouded in mystery and conflicting accounts that have never been fully resolved, creating one of World War II's enduring intelligence enigmas about the fate of the man who made breaking Enigma possible. The official German record states that Hans Thilo Schmidt died in Gestapo custody on September 19, 1943, at Prinz Albrechtstrasse prison in Berlin, with the death officially attributed to suicide. According to this account, Hans Thilo hanged himself in his cell using strips torn from his prison uniform, choosing death over the torture and humiliation of public trial and certain execution. The Gestapo informed his family that he had committed suicide, returning his personal effects, closing the case with bureaucratic efficiency that suggested nothing unusual about a traitor choosing death over facing judgment. But this official account has been questioned by intelligence historians and family members who note inconsistencies and suspicious circumstances surrounding Hans Thilo's death. The timing, coming just months after his arrest when the Gestapo typically took much longer to build cases against important prisoners, suggests possible summary execution rather than suicide. The lack of any trial or public announcement, unusual for the Nazis who normally used treason cases as propaganda opportunities to demonstrate state power and deter other traitors, raises questions about whether the regime wanted to avoid publicizing the extent of Hans Thilo's betrayals, because doing so might alert the Allies that their intelligence source had been compromised. Some historians speculate that Hans Thilo was quietly executed to prevent him from revealing during trial how much information he had provided, what systems had been compromised, and how long the betrayal had continued. Information that would force the German military to acknowledge that their supposedly unbreakable cipher had been penetrated years earlier. Alternative theories about Hans Thilo's fate have emerged, based on post-war intelligence assessments and fragmentary evidence, suggesting possibilities ranging from elaborate deception to international negotiation. One theory proposes that Hans Thilo did not die in 1943, but was instead used by German counterintelligence as a double agent, forced to contact his French handlers and provide disinformation that would mislead Allied intelligence about German intentions. This theory, while lacking definitive proof, would explain the absence of a public trial and the suspicious circumstances of his reported death. Another theory suggests that Hans Thilo might have been part of a prisoner exchange, negotiated through neutral countries, where high-value spies were sometimes traded between warring nations, though no evidence of such an exchange has emerged from archives. The most intriguing theory holds that Hans Thilo was secretly recruited by another intelligence service after his arrest, possibly Soviet intelligence, which was running numerous operations inside Germany, and disappeared into a new identity rather than dying in prison. The deliberate obscurity surrounding Hans Thilo's fate may have been orchestrated by German intelligence services, desperately trying to contain damage from his betrayals, without alerting the Allies that their intelligence source had been compromised. The Germans never changed the fundamental Enigma system after Hans Thilo's arrest, suggesting they did not realize or refuse to accept that he had provided materials that enabled the Allies to break their codes, instead making minor procedural changes that failed to prevent continued Allied reading of German messages throughout the war. This failure to understand the full extent of the damage Hans Thilo had caused, or the unwillingness to admit that their theoretically unbreakable cipher had been penetrated through human treachery rather than mathematical brilliance, represents one of the great intelligence failures of World War II, a case where security arrogance and institutional pride prevented necessary defensive measures. Hans Thilo's brother Rudolf Schmidt, the Wehrmacht general, survived the war despite his relationship to a proven traitor, though his career suffered and he was quietly sidelined to less important commands after Hans Thilo's arrest became known to military leadership. Rudolf apparently never publicly discussed his brother's treason, maintaining silence that might reflect family loyalty, personal shame, or orders from superiors to avoid discussing a security breach that implicated Wehrmacht leadership's failure to properly vet personnel with access to sensitive materials. The Schmidt family, once prominent in German military and academic circles, was effectively destroyed by Hans Thilo's betrayal, with surviving members changing names or immigrating after the war to escape the stigma of being related to one of Germany's most damaging traitors. The true impact of Hans Thilo Schmidt's espionage remained hidden for decades after World War II ended, as British intelligence classified all information about Enigma breaking as top secret, fearing that revelations about Allied code-breaking capabilities might compromise post-war intelligence operations if the Soviet Union or other potential adversaries learned techniques that had proven so valuable. The official histories of World War II, published in the 1950s and 1960s, made no mention of ultra-intelligence or the breaking of Enigma, attributing Allied victories to conventional factors like industrial capacity, manpower, and military leadership, while ignoring the intelligence advantage that came from reading German communications. The Polish mathematicians who had done the initial work breaking Enigma, using materials Hans Thilo provided, received no recognition because Poland was behind the Iron Curtain, and acknowledging their role might create political complications during the Cold War. The revelation of Hans Thilo Schmidt's role in breaking Enigma came gradually, beginning in the 1970s, as British intelligence began declassifying World War II materials and historians gained access to previously secret files. The publication of books about Bletchley Park and ultra-intelligence in the 1970s mentioned the Polish contribution, but initially did not identify the German source who had provided crucial materials. The French intelligence service, protective of sources and methods even decades after the war, was particularly reluctant to reveal details about Hans Thilo's recruitment and the materials he provided. It was not until the 1990s that historians piecing together information from British, French, Polish and German archives definitively identified Hans Thilo Schmidt as the spy codenamed Asche, who had made the initial Enigma break possible. The historical assessment of Hans Thilo Schmidt remains deeply conflicted, as he was simultaneously a traitor motivated by greed who betrayed his country for personal gain, and someone whose betrayal shortened World War II and saved countless lives by enabling Allied intelligence to read German communications. German historians uniformly condemn him as a traitor whose actions cost German lives and aided Germany's enemies, while Allied historians acknowledge his motivation was purely mercenary, but credit his espionage with providing the foundation for one of the war's most important intelligence operations. The moral complexity of a man who did the right thing, helping to defeat Nazi Germany, for entirely wrong reasons, personal greed and resentment, rather than ideological opposition to Hitler or ethical objection to Nazism, makes simple judgment impossible. The intelligence lessons from the Hans Thilo Schmidt case have influenced security practices in every major intelligence service since World War II, highlighting the danger posed by insiders with access to sensitive materials who can be compromised through financial pressure, personal problems, or ideological persuasion. Modern security protocols that include financial monitoring, lifestyle investigations, and psychological evaluations trace directly to understanding that damage from a single compromised insider can exceed any damage that external espionage can achieve. The fact that Hans Thilo's treachery went undetected for 7 years, despite regular contact with foreign intelligence services, despite lifestyle that exceeded his income, and despite security procedures that should have identified him as vulnerable, demonstrated fundamental weaknesses in German counterintelligence that proved catastrophic to Axis security. The cryptographic implications of the Enigma compromise extend far beyond World War II, as the recognition that even theoretically unbreakable codes can be compromised through human factors rather than mathematical attacks transformed how modern cryptography approaches security. The principle that security of any system depends not just on mathematical strength of algorithms, but on protection of keys, procedures, and implementation details, comes directly from understanding how Hans Thilo's betrayal of Enigma keys and operating procedures defeated a cipher that was mathematically sound. Modern cryptographic systems separate key generation, distribution, and storage into distinct functions, with multiple layers of security, specifically because of lessons learned from Enigma's compromise through insider theft rather than mathematical attack. The mystery surrounding Hans Thilo Schmidt's ultimate fate, whether he died by suicide in September 1943, as official records state, or survived through some elaborate deception or exchange, adds appropriate ambiguity to the story of a man who lived in shadows, dealing in secrets, betraying everything for money. The absence of definitive proof about his death, the suspicious circumstances surrounding the official account, the lack of any grave or memorial, create a fitting end for someone whose entire adult life was characterized by deception and duplicity. Whether he died in a Gestapo cell, was secretly executed to avoid public scandal, escaped to new identity through intelligence manipulation, or survived the war in complete obscurity, Hans Thilo Schmidt vanished from history as thoroughly as if he had never existed, leaving only the documents he betrayed and the intelligence legacy he created. The hotel room in Berlin where Hans Thilo Schmidt first betrayed the Enigma secrets in November 1931 no longer exists, destroyed during Allied bombing raids that devastated Berlin in the final years of World War II, physically erasing the location where one of the war's most consequential intelligence operations began. The Grand Hotel itself survived the war, but was later demolished during Cold War reconstructions, removing even the building where espionage that would save millions of lives was initiated by a man motivated purely by greed. This physical erasure of the historical site seems appropriate for a story characterized by deception, hidden identities, and deliberate obscurity, where the most significant events left no monuments and the most important participants disappeared into official secrecy or convenient death. In the final analysis, Hans Thilo Schmidt represents one of history's most consequential yet morally compromised spies, someone whose betrayal of Hitler's blueprint, the Enigma cipher system that protected German military communications, provided the Allies with intelligence advantage that shortened World War II and saved countless lives, yet whose motivation was entirely selfish, driven by greed and resentment, rather than principle or ideology. The fact that we cannot say with certainty how or when he died, that he vanished into uncertainty and conflicting accounts, that even his final fate remains disputed by historians, seems fitting conclusion for a man who lived in shadows and dealt in secrets. Standing in that Berlin hotel room in 1931, arranging stolen documents on the desk, Hans Thilo Schmidt could not possibly have known that the papers he was selling for a few thousand Reichsmarks would enable intelligence operations that would influence the course of history. That Polish mathematicians would use his betrayals to break codes Germany believed unbreakable, that British codebreakers at Bletchley Park would build upon foundations he laid to read Hitler's most sensitive communications, or that historians would argue for decades about whether his fate was suicide, execution, or disappearance into some elaborately constructed deception. What he knew for certain was that he needed money, that he had access to valuable secrets, and that French intelligence would pay well for materials that represented Germany's most closely guarded cryptographic systems. The rest, the consequences that shaped World War II and influenced intelligence operations for generations, the mystery about his ultimate fate, the historical debates about his significance, all flowed from that simple transaction in a Berlin hotel room where greed and opportunity intersected to change the course of history in ways that neither the spy nor his handlers could have imagined.